Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Poe, and today I'm doing week 37 of my 2020 reads. This week I read quite a few graphic works, although none of them were on my TBR, and I DNF'd a few things, so I've got a lot to get through. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can. The first things that I read were volumes 1 through 3 of The Girl from the Other Side by Nagabe, translated by Adrienne Beck, lettered by Blakeslee. This is a manga that I'd heard quite a few people talking about, and it just seemed like it'd be a really nice thing to read. So I picked up these first 3 volumes, and I think that they were really enjoyable, although maybe not perfect. So the story is a fantasy world where there's this plague that turns people into monsters, and so all of the townspeople in this world have built up walls and they stay inside and they don't allow anybody to go outside. They don't allow anybody outside inside because that could spread the plague really easily. But we follow Shiva, who is a little girl who's been left outside. People think maybe she's tainted, and she is taken in by an outsider teacher. But she continues to be human rather than turning into a monster, and he is trying to help her maybe find and reconnect with her aunt, something help her out. So I liked the relationship between teacher and Shiva. I thought it was very, very sweet, although I do think that their characters are maybe a little bit stereotypical of, innocent young girl and kind of awkward scholarly man who doesn't know what to do with a young child. But it was a very sweet relationship. And the fantasy world building is really interesting, although it gets only explored little bit by little bit in each of these volumes, because so much of these volumes is dedicated really just to the artwork. The artwork is absolutely gorgeous. It's this black and white, sketchy, beautiful artwork that really works, I think, and really draws you in if you like artwork. But because so much of the space in the manga is devoted to the artwork, not much happens in terms of plot and world building in each volume. Over time, though, I think it does build up. So I definitely enjoyed these. I plan to continue. I gave the first and third volumes 3.5 stars, and I gave the second volume 4 stars because there was a little bit more plot and world building action that happened in that one. Next, I read 2 graphic works that are part of the Early Earth world created by Isabel Greenberg, the 100 Nights of Hero and the Encyclopedia of Early Earth. Both of these are set in sort of the same world, the same universe, but they're not telling the same storyline. So the Encyclopedia of Early Earth is the first one that was written, although I read it second, and it talks about a storyline of a boy who is kind of finding himself growing up and falling in love, but it's told almost like an Odyssey retelling with many, many adventures that he goes on, places that he goes on, and nested stories within. The 100 Nights of Hero is about 2 women and kind of a 1001 Nights type of retelling where there's, again, many stories nestled within. Both of these books have absolutely gorgeous artwork. I really, really, really love Isabel Greenberg's art style. I think that the colors as well are really interesting because it's black and white but has almost like a watercolor single color overlay on a lot of the images. So absolutely love the artwork in these, and I thought that the mythology that was developed in each of them, because both of these are very much about myths, about stories, was fascinating. Isabel Greenberg has kind of taken she calls it Early Earth, but it's basically very much like Earth but with a different mythology and different sets of gods and things like that, and I like that mythology that she has built. I love myths and stories, so I absolutely loved all of those nested stories in these, and I thought it was also really interesting when I could recognize some of the stories that her stories were based on and how they changed. I did think that the 100 Nights of Hero was really, really good. Even better than the Encyclopedia of Early Earth because the outer story, the sort of 1001 Nights story, really ties things together in a way that the more Odyssey-like one of the Encyclopedia of Early Earth didn't necessarily tie everything together as tightly. So the other thing that I thought was really good about the 100 Nights of Hero is that it's really feminist. It's a queer love story about 2 women, and all of the myths within it really have a feminist bent as well. So I gave the Encyclopedia of Early Earth 4.5 stars and the 100 Nights of Hero 5 stars. Definitely highly recommend both of these. You can pick up either one. It doesn't matter which order. I really think they're just more set in the same world rather than connected to each other directly. I definitely recommend these. Then I DNF'd 3 books, all of which I think actually are good books, but they had certain things that just weren't working for me, so I didn't end up continuing with them. But I do think for all of these that they are well worth picking up if you like the idea of it and if you like the premise. The first book that I DNF'd was You Dream of Terra-Two by Temi O. This is a book that I had on my TBR for Space Opera September, I'll link that below, and is one that I'd heard about from Tori at Tori Morrow, who I will also link below, and Tori very kindly actually discussed this book with me as I was reading, so I got a lot of really cool discussions about it. Even though I did DNF it, I thought that there was so much going on in this book that was really, really worthwhile. I actually got about halfway through. I got to 55% when I DNF'd it. So there was quite a lot going on in here that I was enjoying, just there were a couple of other things that didn't work for me. So the premise of this book is that it's basically modern day Britain, except that there has been a slight alternate history where humans have started to send out spaceships to Mars and things like that. And they have discovered a planet called Terra-Two, which is 23 space travel years away, and they decide to train a bunch of teenagers to be astronauts to go on this so that when they land there, they'll be young enough to still be able to continue a lot of the scientific research. So this story has a lot of really cool things going on. In particular, the main thing that I think this story does is explores a lot of issues of mental health and issues of growing into adulthood. It is a YA space opera, and I think it actually is perfect as such in the way that it explores a lot of these ideas. I had a lot of good discussions with Tori about this, but there's a lot of really curious things it's talking about. Things like depression and the hereditary nature of depression, things like grief, things like finding religion and how you might use that to cope with other things going on in your life. Things like the way that we use sex in different relationships and why people might be pressured into it. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, lots of different characters, and each one of them is kind of handling things. There's also an interesting discussion of privilege and what that means too. And the crew is pretty diverse, so I think that there's just a lot of really good stuff going on here. I think that also the big themes that this is discussing really of this idea that leaving Earth and going on this long journey where you will never come back, going to this very new place that's completely unexplored, a lot of that is used as a metaphor to really explore the idea of, you know, leaving your childhood and going into adulthood and what you're looking forward to, and then what actually happens when you're on that journey and when you've left your childhood, and how those expectations could be different. So there was so much really awesome stuff going on in here. However, the thing that made it difficult for me to continue, and this is always an issue with me, is that there was just a little bit too much drama that happened, like some big events that happened that were just very upsetting. And I've mentioned this before, I just get it's just too intense for me when that kind of drama happens. I liken it to spicy food, where you know, some people, they taste something and it's super spicy and they say, oh, this is so great, I love all the flavor in this. But for other people like me, you taste it and you go, oh my God, my mouth is on fire. And so that's what kind of this sort of reading experience felt like, where there were just so many intense things that it was just overwhelming. And at that 55% mark, there was a scene that I could tell was gonna be real intense, and I put it down and I was like, okay, I'll have to come back to this, and I just never was able to get myself to pick it up again. So it's really not that there's any issue with the writing or the storytelling, it was just a little too intense for me, but I definitely think that a lot of other people could get a lot out of this story, and I think it's a really interesting space opera, although there are definitely a couple of things that, you know, I question some of the decisions that the Space Force was making in choosing teenagers, to be the astronauts. But anyway, I still think it's worth picking up for a lot of other people, even though it didn't really work for me. Another book that I DNF'd that I think would work for so many other people, and in fact has, is Heartstopper Vol.1 by Alice Oseman. Basically, every other person I know has given this 4 or 5 stars, but it just didn't work for me enough to continue. I actually got pretty far in this one too. I DNF'd it at 52%. I liked the artwork. It's a graphic novel that is about 2 high school boys in Britain who fall in love, and I thought that there was a lot of really beautiful work done there. I love the colors. But for me, the storyline of them falling in love was a little bit dramatic. There's a lot of like, oh no, I don't know if he likes me, that kind of thing that happens. And I just wasn't that interested in that kind of emotional turmoil. I think that I noticed this as well because recently I read Check Please by Ngozi Ukazu, and I liked Volume 2 much better than I liked Volume 1, I think because Volume 2, the relationship was already established, whereas in Volume 1, they were doing that whole like, I don't know if he likes me type of thing. And I think that just doesn't appeal to me as much. So I do think that this is a very sweet graphic novel that a lot of people would absolutely love. Just that storyline apparently isn't my thing. Also, weirdly, I noticed that I didn't like the lettering in this. The lettering is kind of big and a little bit messy, and I didn't like that. And so I just wasn't so into this, but I know so many people love it, so I bet most people will, just it didn't work for me. And the last book that I DNF'd was Multiple Choice by Alejandro Zambra, translated by Megan McDowell. This is a poetry collection that I just heard about from Kazen at Always Doing. I'll link her below. And it is really interesting because it's kind of set up like a multiple choice test where you'll have, like, for example, a bunch of different lines of poetry, and then you'll have arrange these in order, and it'll mention different orders of the lines of text, these sorts of things. So it's very experimental, and I think that this is the type of poetry that might be a little bit above my level. I got through 43% of this before DNFing, but I just couldn't get into it. I think that there were 2 issues for me. One was that it was really experimental in terms of the formatting, and then the second was that the messaging was often very like, there was a lot of depression and self-hatred in these poems, and a lot of like very negative relationships with other people. And it was hard for me to really want to be immersed in what the poetry was doing because it was kind of negative. But again, I think that is just a very personal thing. And I think that if you are somebody who likes poetry and is open to that kind of more experimental method, it totally may work for you. It just didn't work out for me so much. So that's everything that I read and DNF'd this week. If you guys have read any of these books, if you have any thoughts, any comments, any recommendations, just go ahead and leave me a comment down below.